all of the other reindeers used to laugh and call him names. Used to. Here's your Christmas spot on the McFarlane Toys Twisted Xmas Rudy the Reindeer. McFarlane Toys' Twisted Xmas line takes a dark and disturbed departure from the merry magical North Pole. Having grown tired of pulling Santa's sleigh, Ruby rebels and pays jolly old Santa a visit he'll never forget. On his path to payback, I hope that Rudy pays a visit to the island of misfit toys. I'd love to see Jack in the Box get his just desserts. Before, of course, we get a closer look at Rudy the Reindeer, let's grab the tape measure and see how tall the figure stands. I don't think, in fact, he's actually called Rudolph. They just decided instead to call him Rudy. It's the only one figure that really does take a departure from his more classic-looking name. Even like Frosty the Snowman was still Frosty the Snowman on the package, but I believe this guy was called Rudy the Reindeer. With his antlers attached on the top of his head, you're looking at the figure standing 7 inches in height, or he's going to be 18 centimeters tall. I'll be filling in the frame quite quickly, bringing the other figures we've already had a look at from the Twisted Xmas line. We first looked at Santa Claus, then we looked at Mrs. Claus, try not to block Santa in the process. Most recently, in fact, we looked at Jack Frost, and then my favorite of the bunch, here's what he also looks like with Frosty the Snowman. Rudy, as he's known by his better friends, comes included with one axe for an accessory. The axe itself does have a festive look to it. Not only does it have a string of jingle bells wrapped all around the handle, but on the end you can also see as well sculpted and painted are tiny little evergreen trees. It does actually detach in 2 places. I don't think when you first got this out of the tray, it's been a long time since I removed these first from their tray, that the axe was in 2 parts, but you do actually want to detach them, as it makes things a lot easier, then slide it into Rudy's hand. The actual handle of it, if you look at it, actually has more of a square base peg instead of a circular peg. But it seems like you can still rotate it around. Like it doesn't have one specific configuration where, like, for example, it doesn't work one way. It seems, even though it is kind of, again, like a squared off circle, it fits fine really just putting it any which way. Although fitting in one way does make it a little bit more secure, but really not by much. The actual head of the axe does look like it would be quite sharp. I do wish that there was maybe a bloodied version. I tried to check online. I don't think, in fact, any of these had bloodied variants. There was the variant, of course, of Mrs. Claus that did have the blonde hair. But I don't think any of the other figures had, like, say, for example, more bloodied versions. Like, usually that was the case when we got, like, the McFarlane movie Maniacs, for example. I don't think the rule applied again when we looked at the Twisted Xmas figures, that there were variants of them. But I do kind of wish in a way that they could have added a whole bit of blood splattered across the actual head of the axe, because I think that would have added a nice touch to him. It looks like he probably has been hacking and slashing the elves. Payback time for all the time they actually didn't even clean out his little pen where he's been sleeping. If they're not going to be cleaning up the mess, then he's going to be making more of a mess for them to clean. Now, the axe does fit into his hand, although it sits really loose. First of all, though, the figure comes also included with a display stand. The figure, though, does need the display stand. As you can see, he sort of collapses. It doesn't really help that one of his legs is extremely loose for all the times that I've actually had this guy on display. But certainly the display stand does come in handy. While there's no reindeer treats, no actual droppings anywhere, what he seems to have is all these little rocks. He's got a big giant rock there on the side. It's still molded in the same sort of frosted blue as the Mrs. Claus we've already had a look at. Jack Frost also had a very similar kind of plastic that they've used. Frosty was a little bit dirtier because they used a more translucent, clear plastic. There is a one peg right here that's going to attach to only one hoof. If you actually look at the figure, not both of them have peg holes. It's only really this one that's going to plug onto the bottom of the base. So when you're attaching them, there really is, again, only one configuration. But while this is a side, I did also want to show you, talking a little bit about the axe. The axe does, as I already mentioned, does detach. You just take the axe, slide it through his hand, and then once you get it through the other side, we're just going to go ahead and plug and cap the end of the axe. The thing about it, though, is that the axe sits really loose. One thing that certainly helps, if I don't drop the bottom of, can I reach it from here? I think I can reach it from here. Can I reach it? There it is right there. All right, good. If you attach it onto the end of the axe like this, what you can kind of do instead is have it resting against his foot, kind of like that. And that kind of helps to hold the axe, because without that, the axe, again, really sits loose inside his hands. Would they be still hands? I guess they would be hooves. If you look at the hand, I think it's a little bit too wide to accommodate the handle of the axe. So again, you might just be easier to kind of rest it against this foot. That's usually what I've usually done in earlier, like all the other times I've usually had these guys displayed on the shelf, as I've got like the axe. Again, like the handle, turning it the one way, like if you have it this way, you can see it really sits loose. You just want to make sure that you've got it lined up properly. Yeah, that's going to stay better in place. But definitely have it resting more against his foot. You'll find it does a much better job of him holding the axe. That being said, let's move that to the side. Getting a closer look at Rudy now. One other thing that is something I suppose that was assembled, I think from what I remember, these antlers were something that attached onto the top of his head. You can see that there's holes on both sides, and then you got the antlers. They basically just plug in place. When I do eventually put these guys back in bags, because these aren't figures that I have out displayed all year round, what I usually do is all the things that are more prone to being bent or broken, I usually take them off and I put them loose inside the bag along with the figure. That goes for, though, Rudy's. With his antlers, these antlers are very prone to bending and warping, and I don't really want to put them back into a bag the way he is right now, because I'm sure these are probably going to warp the softer plastic. So what I usually do is, again, I just take these off, put them back in the bag, and then I put Rudy along with them. The antlers do add a lot more, certainly, to the design of the character. It really is an interesting looking reindeer character, because if you look at it like this, it almost looks as if that's just the head alone, until you realize that's only just the top row of his teeth, as grimy and bloody as they may be. If you look further down, you realize that's the bottom of his jaw right there. He's stretched his jaw in such a way, it kind of reminds me of, what was that one character? Was it the Night Flyer? Was it the Night Flyer that could elongate its jaw like this and wrap around someone's head? Somebody's probably going to let me know down below in the comments section. Like similar to Frosty, you can see there's several rows of teeth. Although the teeth aren't as sharp necessarily as Frosty's, they're these tiny little teeth, but there's so many of them you can imagine he's going to inflict damage when he eventually gets a hold of you. There is also one little interesting point that he has a tongue, and the tongue is sticking out in the back of his throat. Nicely painted on the inside of it. They've given a bit of a sheen, so it looks like it's wet and slimy and mucusy. Really an interesting looking head sculpt for the character. Now, he's got a lot of cool things going for him, is the fact that he has all this sort of reindeer, like sleigh bells. He's got, for example, like Christmas lights wrapped around his arms and his legs, for example. And he's also got it wrapped around the front. So he's a very decorative looking character, which is really something that helps this character's design. If not for that, he literally would just be a back hind leg standing character that just happens to have an axe in his hand. At least to McFarlane's credit, they found an interesting way to add the horror element of it by certainly having the mouth open the way that it is, and added a festive amount to it by adding, again, all these additional pieces. Now, these are attached by the tops, by the shoulders. They sit really loose down below here. And again, like all these little pieces all these lights are sculpted to the actual body itself. He also has some jingle bells down below by his hooves. Again, it's a really fun looking figure. I also really like the fact he has braids. Now, this is one thing that if you're buying this figure loose, you really want to make sure first his antlers are intact. They're not broken. You also want to make sure that he has these dreaded hair, I guess they're kind of hair dreads that he's got also from the back of his hair. These locks, as you can see, have been very, very small, like little tiny braids, but they're only attached by just these tiny little pieces right here. I would imagine that they probably would have attached them loose or attached them separately and not sculpted the figure with it. But it's certainly something. I've seen pictures online of Rudy being sold like loose, and a couple of these were broken off. So you just want to make sure if you're buying this figure, you're buying it with all the 4 strands. He actually has 4 dreadlocks. All of them, the individual braids are all, again, something that's very, very susceptible to breaking. So let's talk a little bit about the figure's articulation. Now, again, like Rudy and all of the Twisted Christmas figures, they're very limited on articulation. You would look at this and you would assume that he only has straight swivels in his shoulders, and you would be correct. So he has swivels on one shoulder. The other shoulder I've never really been able to move. It looks as if I move one of the braids out of the way. You can see like there's a cut right there, and yet I don't think I've ever really been able to move this. I've never really wanted to fight it either, because with one arm moving, that's more than enough for me. I mean, the figure does also have swivels in his wrist, and that's never been a problem, but I've never been able to rotate that one shoulder. I don't even think in the earlier reviews I've done of this guy I've ever really been able to move it. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Like Santa Claus, it does exist, but I'm sure I just don't want to fight it for the risk that I may potentially break the peg. That's the last thing I would want to do, considering the price that these figures are going for now. The figure also has swivels in his legs, and with the time that I've had this figure, years that I've actually had these figures in my collection, unfortunately, like the thighs are the one thing. It's actually the loosest of all the figures I've looked at here. It's the loosest here on Rudy. These swing out so frequently that is really a good thing that the figure does have a display stand, because if not for that, he really just doesn't have the means to stand on his own. I mean, you could kind of balance him successfully, but I feel with the looseness of the thigh the way it is right now, All it really needs to do is swivel out, and Rudy's going to take a tumble. So we're going to go ahead and get him back onto his display stand. Just before we actually do that, I did also want to show you one little additional sculpting. While not maybe necessarily looking like a Spawn skull, it's a very similar type of skull that he has on the front there as well. The figure is really interesting. I don't think he's as interesting, for example, as the other figures we've already had a look at. In a way, I've sort of been like looking at my favorite figures first and then kind of looking at the other figures that just happen to make up this wave. Rudy's an interesting enough character, but he's not my favorite. I think a lot of it also just has to do as well with, I like the sculpting of it. I think in a way, though, maybe the open mouth, the way as elongated as they made it, maybe it takes a little bit away from the character, that if they had maybe made the mouth just a little bit more open like this, I think it loses something until you realize that's the front of his mouth. Because if you're looking at it, actually, you'd think for a second, at least when I first looked at it, I thought his mouth was way up here. I thought his mouth was kind of closed, for example, until I realized his whole entire front torso is his open mouth. Ironically enough, also, not that we were looking at it in the price point in which these figures were still going for. I did say that Mrs. Claus was one of the most expensive. Rudy, unfortunately, though, is one of the least expensive figures when it came to the Twisted Xmas. Looking online right now, I can actually find several Rudy reindeers that are under $80. I found one that was marked down to $67 at the time of doing this review. That's $67 Canadian as well, so it would be even less when it comes to US. He is certainly the easiest, I feel, to find when it comes to these figures. And again, doesn't have necessarily the reasoning why I looked at this guy second to last. He just isn't as interesting maybe as the other four figures that we've looked at before. Of course, I did have to check, and sure enough, it was the 1997 The Night Flyer movie I was thinking of. I'm sure there's other examples as well of a creature elongating, stretching out its jaw to kill its prey, but The Night Flyer was the one I was thinking of. Here, though, Rudy the reindeer I've got displayed here. I don't have the axe resting against his foot, but with the length of the axe handle, you can also rest it on the shelf where you've got the figure displayed. It still sits, unfortunately, loose in his hand, but at least it will prevent the axe from wobbling around. You can also, as well, rest it against his antlers, which I've currently got going as well. Of all the figures that we have gotten in this wave, I think the one that I really wanted the most to be a bloodied release or bloodied variant was Rudy the reindeer. I think it would have added a little bit of charm to that. And considering that really McFarlane at the time that he was doing these figures, this is 2007 after all, predating that, he was doing lots of bloodied variants, even ones from Movie Maniacs, even ones from Spawn. I'm sure surprised that he actually couldn't have done this as well for the Twisted Xmas. Get some more mileage from the mold, after all. I mean, not maybe put blood on all of the characters. Mrs. Claus makes no sense. Maybe Santa Claus could have had some blood on his claws. Jack Frost probably doesn't make any sense either. But I would say that Frosty the Snowman and Rudy the Reindeer could have benefited the most by getting also a bloodied variant released of them. Let me know down below in the comment section if you guys have been collecting the Twisted Xmas figures, if you have Rudy the Reindeer, or if you don't, what do you think of the figure? Let me know down below in the comments section. Also as well, if you guys enjoyed this video, I want to hit with a like. If you guys are loving the content you guys are seeing, we have, by the way, one last figure to review, and that's actually the Santa's Little Helpers. In fact, we're not going to be looking at just one figure. I think there's a total of 3 in that set. So we're going to be looking at those in the upcoming video. To ensure that you're not missing out, by the way, on anything that's coming up here regularly, make sure you hit that bell notification is the crucial thing. Making sure, of course, before that, you're also hitting that subscribe button down below. And, of course, always keep your festive peepers peeled to this channel. Not only during this December month will we be looking at Christmas videos, Christmas spots, but we also will be still going and looking at the regular stuff that always comes here on a regular basis. The horror figures, the superhero figures. There's always an abundance of gifts underneath this guy's tree. Of course, as always, guys, thanks for watching. See you guys next time.